Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give a few more minutes just to let everyone who is logging in get into the video, our virtual presentation. We'll get started in a few minutes. All right, we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for attending the virtual public workshop for the Capacity Enhancement Projects EA at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. My name is Sarah Potter, and I'm the project manager for Lanham & Brown, the consultant who is preparing the EA for the city of Charlotte. The City of Charlotte is hosting this virtual public workshop to discuss the change in the proposed action from Alternative 1 to Alternative 2 and to review the potential impacts of the alternatives presented in the revised draft EA. This virtual public workshop is going to start with a presentation, and then it's going to be followed by a question and answer session where Jack Christine, the Charlotte COO, and myself will be available to answer any questions. All attendees' audio and webcam is disabled. So to submit a question, you need to hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, and there's a Q&A button, and you can press on that to insert a question anytime during the presentation. If you have a specific question about a slide, please enter the slide number so we can refer back to that when we are answering the question. If there are any media inquiries, we ask you to please email media@cltairport.com. And then we also want to let everyone know that comments and questions that are submitted during this presentation are not included as official record on the official record of comments. So we strongly encourage everyone to submit all comments via email with the website or the email address for the project, either the U.S. Postal Service, or you can also leave an oral comment in the public hearing following this workshop. These comments that are submitted via those three methods will be in the official record and considered in the final EA and responded to. So lastly, this event is being recorded, so I just want everyone to know that, and that it will be posted to the project website following this presentation. All right, the agenda, we're going to start off talking about the purpose of the meeting, which, as I previously said, it's to discuss the Alternative 1 to Alternative 2 change in the proposed action from what was originally in the May version of the draft EA. We'll then start discussing the purpose and need, or I'm sorry, we'll first look at the roles and responsibilities, the EA process, talk about the purpose and need, look at the alternatives, and then look at the potential impacts, and then end with a Q&A session. All right, since the publication of the draft in April of 2021, Charlotte, the airport has made the decision to change their proposed action from Alternative 1 to Alternative 2. We'll review the differences between those two alternatives on the next slide. But first, we just want to describe, just to let you know why this change occurred. And this was done because in June of 2021, and that was after our last public meeting, FAA released a joint order update to their air traffic control order. And that is an order that describes the required separation between runways and how those runways can be used. So that update to that order allowed dual simultaneous arrivals to parallel runways with 3,200 feet of separation during IFR conditions or during, inclement weather conditions. The previous version required 3,600 feet of separation. So this reduction in separation requirements provides operational flexibility to air traffic control in Alternative 2 that was not available with the Alternative 1 separation. All right, so the difference, you can see that this slide here shows the two alternatives. Alternative 1 on the left has a new midfield runway. It is separated from the west runway by 3,100 feet and separated from the center runway by 1,200 feet. Alternative 2 on the right is a 10,000 foot runway also. However, the separation between the west runway and that new runway is 3,200 feet. And then the separation between the center runway and the new runway is 1,100 feet. So Alternative 2 shifted the new runway 100 feet to the east. So the EA capacity analysis determined that both of these alternatives would have the same capacity because the primary runway use would be the same. And that's because during peak arrival periods, 3 runways are needed for triple simultaneous arrivals. And so those runways that would be used during that peak time for arrivals are the west runway, the existing center runway, and then the east runway. And so departures would primarily occur on the new runway and the east runway, which is a mixed use runway. So that is the same assumption between both alternatives for runway use. Both Alternative 1 and 2 were analyzed in the draft EA in the previous version and again in the revised draft that was just published, and neither alternative resulted in significant impacts. So now going forward, Alternative 2 is going to be referred to as the proposed action rather than Alternative 1. All right, so the rest of this information I will tell you for those who attended the previous presentation is virtually the same. So you'll hear a lot of the same information. All right, so the roles and responsibilities in preparing the EA, the FAA is the lead federal agency, and they're ultimately responsible for compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and also the scope and content of the EA. FAA then also will issue a decision on the EA and the implementation of the project. The City of Charlotte is the airport sponsor and is responsible for preparing the EA also in accordance with NEPA and all other regulations. And the city leads all the public outreach for this EA too. And then Landerman Brown, which is the consultant, works under the direction of the City of Charlotte and is preparing the EA also in accordance with NEPA. And then we lead the work of all sub-consultants that are on the project as well. So the purpose of an EA is to analyze and document potential environmental effects from a proposed action and also look at the alternatives and then develop any mitigation measures that may be needed from those impacts. So this slide shows the EA process, which started from the conversion from the EIS to the EA and then leads into the purpose and need, development of alternatives. We also look at the affected environment, environmental impacts that were impacts were analyzed for each alternative. And then we had a draft EA that was published on April 16th and had a 45-day public comment period. We also held virtual public workshops back in May on the 17th and 18th, and also a hearing on that draft EA. We are now we issued a revised draft document, which was published on October 8th. So this is a new public workshop and public comment period and hearing that we will have. And then after that, 45-day period will lead into the final EA. All right, moving on to the purpose and need. There are two needs that the airport is addressing with this project. The first is insufficient gate capacity and ramp congestion. A gating analysis was completed on the FAA approved forecast, and the results you see on the screen in the table. A total of 140 gates would be needed in 2028 and 150 would be needed in 2033. If no additional gates are constructed in the future, aircraft would have to hold on the airfield after landing to wait for an available gate. And having that occur results in increased congestion on the pavement surrounding the terminal. And these excessive wait times during peak periods, that greatly affects an airline's schedule integrity and could ultimately lead to passengers missing connections. And complicating the gate shortage is also the ramp movement area, which is the pavement that surrounds the terminal complex. There are 5 concourses at Charlotte, A, B, C, D, and E, you can see on the screen. And each provides a combination of single taxi lanes, which is the red line on the diagram, and dual taxi lanes, which is the green line on the diagram. The dual parallel taxi lanes provide the ability for aircraft to operate in opposite directions at the same time. Single taxi lanes, which is the red line, only have one bi-directional flow so that only one aircraft can be moving in one direction at a time. This results in major ramp congestion, especially in the areas of Concourse D and E where the single taxi lane is. These 2 concourses have 55 gates together, which is approximately half the gate capacity at the airport. So this leads to high traffic volumes on that single taxi lane. And additionally, Concourse E is the regional jet concourse. And as a result, aircraft have more turns per gate, which means that there are more operations per gate per day than any other concourse, which also adds to the congestion. All right, the second need for the project is addressing insufficient runway capacity to meet future demand at acceptable levels of delay. An acceptable level of delay for this project was defined as an all-weather average of 7 minutes of runway delay per operation. We conducted airfield simulations to understand the level of runway delays that are currently occurring at Charlotte. And what the simulation showed is that the number of aircraft operations that can be processed by the runway, which is the throughput, increases by 13% between 2016 and 2028, whereas the all-weather average delays increase by 21%. So these changes in throughput and delay demonstrate that the runway system has the ability to achieve greater throughput beyond that 2016 operation level, but it does so at rapidly increasing delays. And as a result, it's reasonable to conclude that the Charlotte runway system was approaching capacity in 2016. Now, when you look at 2028 and between 2028 and 2033, the throughput increases to only 4%, by only 4%, but the delay increases at a much more rapid pace at 24%. So this relationship shows us that the between throughput and delay, that the runway system reaches capacity around 2028. So based on the previous set of needs that we just looked at, the airport developed a set of project elements to address those needs. These elements are collectively referred to as the proposed action. The proposed action, which is now Alternative 2, includes a 10,000-foot runway, which you see on the diagram in purple, as well as north and south end around taxiways. As previously mentioned, the difference between the 2 alternatives is really the shift in the runway to the east by 100 feet. As part of that, West Boulevard would require relocation using Byram and Piney Top. And then the other elements are the concourse elements, which is expansion of concourses B and C, expanding the ramp to the south to create east-west corridors, which allows for more efficient movement of aircraft. And then it also includes a closure of runway 523 and then dual taxi lanes around the entire terminal area. So when looking at alternatives, the Council on Environmental Quality requires that an EA explore and consider all reasonable and feasible alternatives to a proposed action that also meet the purpose and need and could do so possibly with a lesser environmental impact. So as a result, the EA looked at a thorough and objective assessment of alternatives. This analysis was posted in a virtual presentation back in December of 2020 to the project website. And in that presentation, it described each of the alternatives, which you'll also see in this presentation, that were carried forward in the EA for potential environmental impacts. The Council on Environmental Quality also requires that the no action alternative be carried forward in an EA, even though we know it does not meet the purpose and need of the project. And the reason really is that no action is used as a basis of comparison back to each, you compare each alternative back to the no action to understand the level of impacts from each alternative. The no action alternative for this EA includes airport infrastructure that is out there today, with the exception of there's additional independent improvement projects that are currently in design or under construction. These projects are circled in orange on the slide, and each of those have undergone their own independent NEPA documentation and approval process. These projects include Concourse A Phase 2 Pier, and then the ramp expansion. So that's on the north side of Concourse A, the existing Concourse A. There's also the north end around taxiway on the existing center runway. There's hold pads that are located out in the west midfield, a de-ice pad on the south airfield, and also a crossfield taxiway. In the no action scenario, operations are assumed to continue to increase at the same levels that are forecasted for all the other alternatives. And the airport would just continue to experience increases in delay with the existing runways that are in place. And they would also experience continued congestion in the terminal area and a shortage of aircraft gates. All right, so go through each of these alternatives that were looked at. So alternative 1 included a new runway in the midfield, and it also included the north and south end around taxiways. The runway, as I mentioned, would be 3,100 feet to the east of the west runway and 1,200 feet to the west of the center runway. This alternative also includes expansions of concourses B and C, crossfield taxiway corridors with the ramp expansion to the south and closure of runway 523, and the dual taxi lanes all around the terminal area. This new runway is assumed to be primarily used for departures. Therefore, it's a 10,000-foot runway. And that's based on the capacity analysis that described the need for 3 simultaneous arrival runways. So based on that information, as I previously mentioned, arrivals would land on the west runway, the existing center runway, and the east runway, and departures would primarily occur on the new runway and also the east runway. Alternative 2, which is the new proposed action, is very similar to alternative 1. The big difference is really the location of the new runway, which is shifted 100 feet to the east. This runway is also assumed to be primarily a departure runway, therefore it's 10,000 feet long. So the runway use would be virtually the same as what alternative 1 had. Arrivals on the west runway, the existing center runway, and the east runway, and departures would primarily occur on the new runway and the east runway. All right, alternative 3 also includes a new runway in the midfield. However, this one is located 3,400 feet to the east of the west runway, and the separation between the existing center runway and the new runway would be 900 feet. This new runway, the runway in this alternative is only 8,900 feet long, and that is because it was assumed to be primarily used for departures. For arrivals, sorry, primarily used for arrivals. So the runway use in this alternative assumes this would be the west runway would be an arrival runway, the new runway would be the arrival runway, and the east runway would also be the arrival runway. And departures would occur on existing center and the east runway. All right, moving on to the environmental impact analysis. Each of these 3 alternatives were evaluated for their potential impact on 18 resource categories, which you see here listed on this slide. The next section of this presentation will review the potential environmental impacts for the categories you see in bold. All of the other remaining categories were fully analyzed in the revised draft EA, which you can find online. And if you need any information, that is the place to go for any of those categories. So in this presentation, we're going to concentrate on Department of Transportation Act Section 4F impacts, historic, archaeological, and cultural resources, and noise compatible land use, and then also water resources, which includes wetlands, floodplains, surface water, groundwater, and wild and scenic rivers. All right, we'll start with historic, architectural, archaeological, and cultural resources. The National Historic Preservation Act is the primary law governing the preservation of historic and prehistoric resources. Section 106 of that act requires that the FAA determine the potential effects of undertakings, or what we call the proposed action. This study area that you see on the screen is identified in purple, is called the area of potential effect, and is what is required when you do Section 106 analysis. This boundary was identified to include all areas that could be physically impacted by the project, but also includes areas that could be visually or impacted by noise. There are 2 historic resources that are located within that purple boundary. The first one is the WPA Douglas Airport hangar, which is identified as the number 1. It's on the northeast side of the boundary. It's right below the purple line on the northeast side. And the other is the old terminal building, which is identified as the number 2 in the midfield on the east side near the GA area. Both of these properties were determined to be eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Our impact analysis that we completed as part of the EA determined that the WPA Douglas Airport hangar would have no adverse effect. It would not be impacted by physically, by noise, or visually by this project. The old terminal building, however, was determined that it would have a direct adverse effect, as it would be required to be removed with the implementation of the proposed action and alternatives 1 and 3. So as a result of that, the FAA and the North Carolina Historic Preservation Office have entered into a memorandum of agreement to address the impact and to mitigate the effect. All right, the next category is the U.S. Department of Transportation Section 4F. These are resources which are publicly protected. They include publicly owned parks, recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and historic sites of national, local, or state significance. So for the 4F resources in this study, we used the same area that was used in the historic analysis. So you can see that area in purple, and that is our study area. As previously described, there are 2 historic properties located within this boundary, the WPA hangar and also the old terminal building. Those are both considered Section 4F resources. There are no other 4F resources within this purple boundary. So when discussing Section 4F impacts, there are 2 types that you look at. The first is a physical use, and the second is a constructive use. And a physical use would occur when the action involves actual physical taking of the property. A constructive use would occur when impacts on the property are so severe that the activities, features, or attributes that qualify the property for 4F are substantially impaired. So implementation of all the alternatives was determined to have a physical use on the old terminal building as it's going to be removed. The WPA Douglas Airport hangar was determined it would not have a physical or constructive use with the implementation of any of the alternatives. So as previously described, to mitigate that impact, the FAA and North Carolina Historic Preservation Office have entered into a memorandum of agreement to address that. All right, moving on to noise and noise compatible land use. So a significant impact would occur if an action or an alternative would increase noise by a 1.5 decibel or more for a noise sensitive area within the 65 DNL or more. So for example, if a noise sensitive facility had an increase from 65.5 DNL to 67 DNL, based on FAA regulations, that would be considered a significant impact. And that would go the same if it was 63.5 to 65. So that would also constitute a significant impact. Now, just because a noise sensitive facility is located within a 65 DNL noise contour does not necessarily mean it's significantly impacted. It would have to also be within a 1.5 dB increase area. So the FAA requires that we use a model called AEDT to determine what the noise contours are for the no action and also for each of the alternatives. So on the screen, what you see are the noise contours for alternative 1. The no action is in black, and the alternative 1 noise contour is in the blue line. And the 1.5 dB increase area is shown in the green hatched in next to the new runway is where you see it. That area, the 1.5 dB increase area, remains completely over compatible land use, and therefore there are no significant impacts with alternative 1, and no mitigation would be required. Within the 65 DNL of the alternative 1 noise contour, there is 21 less residential units than what was in the no action. There's also 1 less school, there's 1 more church, and 1 more daycare facility. All right, this next slide shows alternative 2. Again, same type of analysis that was completed. The no action is in the black hatched line, and the alternative 2 noise 65 DNL noise contour is in the blue line. And again, you see the green hatched area is the 1.5 dB increase area. Again, that area falls entirely over compatible land use, and therefore there are no significant impacts with alternative 2. There would, however, be 17 less residential units with this alternative when you compare it back to the no action. There's also 1 less school, one more church, and 1 more daycare facility. All right, and the last alternative, alternative 3, same analysis. You see the no action in black, the alternative 3 contour in blue. And you also see the 1.5 dB green hatched area, which extends off of the airport property south over residential areas. And as a result, there would be a significant impact with alternative 3. In this alternative, there would be an increase of 4 residential units, 1 less school, 1 more church, and 1 more daycare facility when you compare it back to the no action. All right, this next slide is a zoom in of that green hatched area that you saw in the previous slide. In this green hatched area is the significant impact area, and within there would be 20 housing units, approximately 50 people are located within that area. Of those 20 housing units, 16 have been previously sound insulated. So if this alternative was chosen to be implemented, mitigation would be required for the 4 remaining houses. All right, our last category that we're going to look at is water resources. And this slide shows the impact analysis for all 3 alternatives. Again, this includes wetlands, floodplains, surface water, and groundwater. You can see the study area that is defined on the slide. It's in that yellow-orange color. And this is the area where there would be physical impacts that could potentially impact those water resources. The construction of all 3 alternatives would result in impacts to approximately 5 acres of wetlands and 8,150 linear feet of streams. Those impacts would require an individual permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they would also require mitigation through the purchase of stream and wetland credits from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Stormwater Services Umbrella Stream and Wetland Mitigation. There are also 13 acres of a 100-year floodplain that would require coordination with FEMA and remapping of the floodplains. And that's located on the south, just to the east of the new runway there. There's also additional 211 acres of new impervious surface from the new ramp expansion and the runway. This increase in impervious surfaces would be accommodated through the airport's existing stormwater system. And then lastly, there's 2 wells that are located just south of Concourse B there. Those would need to be abandoned, and they would be done so in accordance with any federal, state, or local requirements. So in summary, Alternative 1 and Alternative 2, which is now the proposed action, would have no significant impacts on any of these environmental impact categories. However, Alternative 3 would have it would have impacts on residential units from noise. As everyone knows, we're still experiencing COVID. The pandemic is still in effect here. We're still dealing with all the ramifications of what's going on. However, the industry has always bounced back from every other major incident that has occurred. When we looked at FAA TAF forecasts, they predict, that's the FAA forecast, the terminal area forecast. They predict that operations return to 2019 levels around the year 2024 for the entire, they're just generalizing the entire US. However, what we're seeing at Charlotte are that operations are only down about 5% from September of 2021 to when you compare it back to September of 2019. So they're tracking very closely to September or to 2019 operation levels and passengers. All right, so if you have any questions, please submit them now on in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. However, if you would like to submit a written comment to be considered formally in the record, you can do so by submitting it to the email that you see on the screen. You can also submit it through U.S. Postal Service at the address you see there, 4445 Lake Forest Drive. And those all must be submitted by November 22nd in order to be included in the official record. Once those comments are received, they'll be reviewed and the comments will be responded to in the final. I just want to make sure everyone's aware that the comments we received on the draft EA were included, the responses to those were included in the most recently published revised draft EA. So we'll do the similar type of responses for any comments received on this draft. Following that, then FAA issues their federal decision on the project. So with that, that is the end of our presentation. We are now going to switch to the Q&A session. And if you just give me 1 second, I can look over here at the questions that were asked. All right, so the first question is, why are there no landings on runway 36 left? So 36 left is the most east runway. Let's just go back, Kevin, to a diagram just so everyone can see. Go back, yeah, keep going. Like the alternatives would be good. Okay, so 36 left is the westernmost parallel runway here, and that is an arrival runway. That is only used for departures probably in an emergency. Very, very, very few departures would ever occur on that runway. It's almost entirely used by arrivals. So maybe I misspoke when I was explaining one of the slides, but that western runway is an arrival runway. And that continues throughout all of the alternatives. And that's the assumption that we used. Okay, so the next question is there a cap on how many flights will throughput? There is no cap. That is not something that Charlotte does or the FAA does at Charlotte. And in the future, that is not assumed to also occur. That was not part of our assumptions. Jack, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I don't have anything to add. That's correct, Sarah.
Okay.
The airport is a public infrastructure, has to be available for any and all activity based on the requirements of the FAA.
Yep. All right. Okay. So the question, I guess I didn't answer the question, why are there no landings on why just for arrivals on 36 left and no departures? Well, part of that has to do with the runway length. So the runway is a 9,000-foot runway. That west runway is a 9,000-foot runway. It also has a very long taxi time, and it would require aircraft to cross multiple runways to get to the west runway. So operationally, it's not efficient to use that runway as a departure. It's mainly an arrival runway. I will say air traffic ultimately dictates how they like to operate the airfield. We had many meetings with air traffic officials during this project, and never once did they want to use the west runway for departures due to operational. It's just not efficient. Okay, next question. Is the new runway extend over west? Would Byram Drive be widened? Also, would it be possible to have west go through a tunnel under the runway instead? That roadway, to go through to construct a tunnel is not cost efficient. I know that was considered briefly. It's extremely expensive. Ultimately, that road is going to be replaced in the future by the Western Parkway. So this right now will alleviate the issue of needing to relocate that roadway due to this runway. But ultimately, Western Parkway is going to replace that entire corridor. So parts of Byram may need to be widened slightly. However, that would need to be looked at in the actual design, the final design, and we're not quite there yet. Okay. Last question I see is, what was the rationale for decreasing the runway length from 12,000 feet to 10,000 feet? So in the EIS, the original proposed action was 12,000 feet. That length was based on an analysis that was based on forecasts that were completed back in probably 2016 timeframe, maybe a little earlier. Since that time, the forecasts of operations have been updated. And through that update, they looked at what the fleet mix would look like. So what type of aircraft would fly at the airport. And based on looking at the fleet and the type of aircraft, it was determined that what's called the critical aircraft, which is the aircraft you look at to determine what the runway length should be. And this is all based on FAA guidance that you're supposed to follow. That critical aircraft only needed 10,000 feet. So at that point, 12,000 feet could not be justified, and the runway length was reduced to 10,000 feet. Okay, next question. Is there a correlation between the length of runway and noise levels? Sometimes not. There's many factors that go into noise levels. Those have to do with the runway length. So the threshold on the runway where the aircraft starts its takeoff and where it actually lands. It also has to do with the type of aircraft that are using that runway. It has to do with the number of operations on that runway, and it also has to do with flight tracks. So there's no one factor that ultimately determines the noise contour at an airport. It's all of those factors are inputted into the noise model, and that is how the noise contours are determined. Okay. I think I've gone through all of these. If anybody has any additional ones, we can stand by until and give a few minutes to see if there are any additional questions. Otherwise, what we're going to do is take an intermission until 3:30, and that is when the public hearing will start. And the public hearing is an opportunity for everyone to orally submit their formal comments. Just so everybody's aware, there will be no responses given during that public hearing. It is just a way for you to orally give your comment, and then we'll have a court reporter who will transcribe everything, and we'll make sure to have those in the official record. But there will be no formal question and answers during that time. All right, so I don't see any additional questions. So we will go into our intermission, and then you can remain on this line. This is the same link and line that will have the public hearing, so you don't need to log off or log back on. You can just hang on, and then at 3:30 we'll be back and start the public hearing.